On the morning of June 6, 1944, while thousands of young men were being cut down by machine gun fire on the beaches of Normandy, while landing craft were filling with water and bodies, while the entire Allied command was holding its breath and praying the invasion wouldn't collapse in the first hour, a small British tank was already 3 miles inland, moving through French countryside in the early morning light, and had been fighting for hours before the first soldier even touched the sand. Nobody talks about this tank. Nobody makes movies about it. You won't find it on the cover of history books sitting next to the Sherman or the Churchill or the Tiger. But without it, and without the genuinely insane idea that put it there, the opening hours of the most important military operation in human history could have looked very different indeed. The story of the A17 Tetrarch begins not with a government order or a military requirement, but with a private company that decided to build a tank because it believed it had a better idea than anyone currently in charge. In 1938, Vickers Armstrongs looked at the state of British light tank design and concluded, with a level of corporate confidence that was either visionary or completely reckless depending on how you look at it, that they could do significantly better than what the Army was currently fielding. The Mark VI light tank, which was the standard British reconnaissance vehicle at the time, was fast enough and small enough, but was armed with machine guns only and offered almost no protection against anything more serious than small arms fire, which in the context of a modern European war was approximately as useful as bringing a kitchen knife to an artillery duel. So, Vickers did something unusual and began designing a completely new light tank using their own funding without waiting for anyone in the War Office to ask them to do it. And from the very beginning, the design was built around 3 principles that set it apart from everything the British Army was currently using. It needed to be genuinely fast in a way that could be sustained across rough ground. It needed to be armed with a proper gun that could actually threaten enemy armoured vehicles. And it needed to be compact in a way that no previous British tank had prioritised, because Vickers had a sense, even in 1938, that a small tank might be able to go places that larger vehicles simply could not reach, though at that point nobody had quite worked out what those places might be. The result was a vehicle weighing approximately 7.5 tons, armed with a 2-pounder gun that was in 1938 a genuinely capable anti-tank weapon, powered by a Meadows 12-cylinder engine, producing around 165 horsepower and capable of reaching 40 miles per hour on roads, and narrow enough in its dimensions to create operational possibilities that nobody at Vickers had fully articulated yet, but that would eventually change everything about how this tank was used. When the prototype was presented to the War Office, the reception was what you might charitably describe as lukewarm, and the Army placed a modest order, acknowledged that the vehicle was capable, and then proceeded to not think very hard about what to do with it, which was a pattern that would continue for the next several years with a consistency that bordered on the impressive. Through 1940 and into 1941, approximately 177 Tetrarchs were completed, and the tank existed in a strange institutional limbo where it was officially in the inventory but had no clear operational role and no coherent plan for deployment. Some went to North Africa and were quietly withdrawn when the terrain proved hard on the running gear. A number went to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease, where they were reportedly appreciated by Soviet crews who valued the speed and reliability, which at least meant someone was getting use out of them. But in terms of British operational planning, the Tetrarch remained an answer looking for a question, sitting in workshops while the war moved forward without it. And then somebody had an idea that changed everything. And that idea was so strange and so operationally ambitious that it's genuinely difficult to understand how it got approved at all. Except that by 1941, the British military was in a position where unconventional thinking was getting more serious consideration than it would have received in peacetime. The idea was straightforward in its logic and extraordinary in its implications. Instead of driving tanks to the battlefield along roads that had to be in friendly hands and free of obstacles, what if you simply flew the tanks directly over all of those problems and landed them precisely where you needed them, behind enemy lines at a moment of your own choosing, with complete tactical surprise? The vehicle that made this possible was the Hamilcar glider, a massive wooden aircraft with a wingspan of 110 feet designed specifically to carry heavy equipment, including armoured vehicles. And when engineers calculated which British tank could physically fit inside the Hamilcar's fuselage with enough clearance to be loaded and unloaded under operational conditions, the answer was the Tetrarch, because its narrow profile made it the only gun-armed British tank that could fit without modification. What had seemed like an unremarkable design characteristic suddenly became a decisive advantage. And a vehicle the army had been quietly ignoring for 3 years abruptly became the centerpiece of an entirely new concept that had no precedent in military history. You could fly a tank into battle, and the Tetrarch was the tank you were going to fly. The soldiers of the 6th Airborne Armoured Reconnaissance Regiment trained through 1943 and into 1944, practicing the complete sequence from loading tanks into gliders through the flight to landing and immediate transition to combat. And by the time they were ready, they had developed a remarkable level of competence in a form of warfare that had been invented only recently, and for which there was no accumulated doctrine or experience to draw upon. They understood that the moment their gliders touched down, they would have minutes before the enemy responded, and that those minutes needed to be used with maximum aggression, because the Tetrarch could not absorb significant punishment, and survival depended entirely on speed and surprise. On the night of June 5, 1944, the Hamilcar gliders carrying the Tetrarchs were towed into the air over England as part of Operation Tonga, and as they crossed the English Channel in darkness toward the Normandy coast, the crews had the particular experience of knowing they were at the very tip of the spear of the largest military operation in history, while being completely unable to do anything about their situation except sit in the dark inside a wooden aircraft and wait. The gliders released from their tugs and descended toward the landing zones east of the Orne River, and what followed combined genuine heroism with the kind of operational chaos that accompanies any action conducted at night in unfamiliar territory against an enemy that, despite being surprised, was neither stupid nor willing to cooperate with Allied timetables. Some gliders landed accurately, and the Tetrarchs rolled out into the French night ready to fight. Others came down in fields that required rapid improvisation. But across the landing zone, as the first hours of June 6th unfolded, Tetrarch tanks were moving through the Norman countryside, engaging German positions and holding ground that was critical to the entire left flank of the invasion, all while the seaborne forces were still approaching the beaches or struggling through the water and obstacles on the shoreline. The psychological impact of armoured vehicles appearing in territory the Germans believed could only be reached by lightly armed paratroopers was deeply disorienting to the defenders. And the time lost to that recalculation was time that Allied forces used to consolidate positions and prepare for the German response that everyone knew was coming. What makes the story of the Tetrarch genuinely worth remembering is the chain of contingencies that had to fall into place for it to be there at all on that morning. If Vickers had not spent their own money on a design nobody asked for, the tank would not have existed. If the Hamilcar had been built to different dimensions, the Tetrarch's narrow profile would have meant nothing. If the War Office had been more decisive in its rejection rather than placing a small order and forgetting about it, the vehicle might have been cancelled before the airborne concept emerged to give it a purpose. The Tetrarch was the right tank for a role nobody had designed it for. And the fact that all of these pieces came together the way they did says something honest about how military history actually works, which is considerably messier and more accidental than the clean narratives written about it afterward. The A17 Tetrarch deserves to be remembered not as a great tank in the way the Sherman or the T-34 are remembered, but as something more specific and in some ways more interesting, which is what happens when a good engineering solution exists in the right place at the right moment and gets used by people creative enough to see possibilities the original designers never imagined. It was a tank that flew. It was a tank that fought before the beaches were reached. It was a tank the army ordered and then forgot about that ended up contributing to the liberation of Europe anyway on its own terms. through a combination of technical capability and operational imagination that produced one of the most unusual combat roles in the history of armored warfare. And the next time you watch footage of D-Day, remember that somewhere east of the Orne River, in the grey light before dawn, a small British tank that nobody had asked for was already doing its job, 3 miles ahead of everyone else, exactly where it needed to be.